Welcome to the Triage Thoughts podcast. My name is Gary McGowan and I am here with Paddy Farrell, the other half of Triage Method. How are you this week, Paddy?
Some would say the better half, but look, that's just some people. I am fantastic, as always, Gary. It is a lovely 38, 40 degrees right now, the optimal temperature for human life.
Of course.
And having a great time. I only have a small amount of time left in Boise, and then I'm going on a fucking adventure for like 3 weeks. So I'm enjoying myself. Looking forward to the next couple of weeks. But I'm also looking forward to being back in Ireland, especially because it'll be August then, the only month in Ireland that actually has some sun. But yeah.
Don't get your hopes up.
Yeah, fair. How are you, Gary?
I'm very good. As you can see, if you're watching, which you should be, because it's better to watch us, got a slitter in my hand because I moved to Cork, right? And as everyone knows, Kerry, despite winning the first All-Ireland in hurling, I believe, that's my only GAA factoid, we're not the greatest at hurling. So now that I'm up here in Cork, I'm being shown the ropes. So this is my slitter. That's the crack. So yeah, I moved to Cork, and that's the crack.
It's disgusting. And why did you move to Cork?
I moved to Cork because I'm going back to college to study gender studies.
Oh, fucking unreal. I cannot wait to start putting out articles about that. I didn't want to put stuff out because, it's not one of our lived experiences, and you're not allowed to write about stuff that you haven't lived, your experience.
Of course.
So I can't wait until you actually get that degree.
But yeah, it is gender studies, but they basically mask it by calling it medicine. They say, all right, so medicine. I'm gonna study it and see what's on the inside loop. I did actually get, by the way, as soon as I got accepted into the course, I got this email like right away from Big Pharma, who actually sent me a paycheck right away. It's pretty cool, like.
That's pretty convenient. Like, they already just get you on the payroll from the start, like.
Yeah, because someone said that in the last podcast we supposedly said that you should trust your doctor, and then I just happened to also get into medicine. So someone wrote to me and they were like, so that's why you said that on the podcast. I'm a shill.
That's what I always say as well. Like, we're just, realistically, we've always been shills. Anyone in the health and fitness industry has always been a shill for Big Pharma. Like, if they tell you otherwise, they're lying to you. Because, like, you think about it, like, especially with this whole stuff where they push, like, this bodybuilding kind of narrative, like, all we're trying to do is sell more Trenbolone, sell more steroids. Pharma makes a killing, which is actually really, really funny, because you'll see a lot of people saying, like, don't trust your doctor. They all just are sponsored by Big Pharma. And then they're literally running grams of steroids. I'm like, you realize you get this from Big Pharma. So if anything, you are the shill. You are the one that's financing Big Pharma. But anyway, I digress. Gary, what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about goal setting, realistic goal setting, what that should look like, and how comparison can often be the thief of joy. So that's today's podcast.
Yeah, and the reason we want to talk about this is because we've actually said it on numerous podcasts where it's like, oh yeah, like always, depending on your goals. And we've mentioned goals hundreds of times, right? But also, I feel like people don't actually understand what that means, because people end up having all of the goals and none of the goals. And we've talked about this before. And this is also a consequence, or we'll call it a side effect, that can actually derail you of that kind of generalist mindset we were talking about. I think it was the last day, was it? Anyway, one in the podcast, that kind of generalist mindset where you can have this generalist mindset and this generalist goal, but as a result, you can end up with a ridiculous amount of goals and have no actual goals, if that makes sense. Where you're like, oh, well, I want to be good at this, and I want to be good at this, and I want to be good at this, but I'm not sure of like how to actually set that up in terms of my hierarchy of those goals, or how to go about achieving those goals, or, all that kind of stuff. So I feel like a discussion around goal setting and what that actually means and what that actually looks like at the individual level and also the kind of bigger picture level helps a lot of people actually start thinking these things through, and then also putting in place a proper structure to, again, think and act their thoughts through. So goal setting, Gary, if you have a client that comes to you, how do you start this process of goal setting? Okay, because obviously we have a pretty comprehensive intake form for our clients, so we can already get a picture, an idea of what they're trying to achieve, what they want to do. And like one of the ways we do that is have this kind of ranking system where it's like, these are some general goals, fat loss, muscle gain, sports specific, whatever, right? And just get people to rank them. Be like, what's the order of what you want to achieve? What's the most important thing to you right now? And we're going to get to that in a second when we talk about like shorter term goals and longer term goals. But that's how we kind of start that process. But obviously that's only the start of the process, because it's a communication. Coaching is always a communication where you actually have to engage with the individual and then start getting that feedback and start tweaking things. Because quite often, and you've seen this play out as well in the political world, the philosophical world, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, where people say things, but they act different things. Or people say they want something, but they act completely dichotomous. Like you'll see this as well. Like, for example, celebrities, they'll bang on about climate change. They're like, oh, climate change, it's such a bad thing, blah, blah, blah. But then they'll take private jets to these climate change summits. It's like, okay, well, that's fundamentally dichotomous to what you're preaching. Or you'll see them as well say stuff like, oh, guns are bad, guns are wrong, whatever the fuck, right? But then they'll also have movies that promote gun violence where it's like, oh yeah, I have no problem starring in Rambo and killing fucking thousands of people with just a fucking gun, It's like, okay, well, that makes no sense. And they also have security guards that have guns. So it's like your actions are not the same as what you're saying, right? So you see this a lot everywhere, but you see this a huge amount in the fitness industry, because people say they want things, but they don't act out those things. And it's kind of like they say these things because they know it's what people want to hear, or it's what they think they should have as a goal, when in reality they want something else. So how do you kind of start that process of actually deciphering the goal of the individual? Like how do we get this process started?
Yeah, so firstly, like our questionnaire is definitely something that does help a lot, because essentially what we do in our questionnaire, and this is something like, if you're a coach, it's worth considering. If you're an individual, it's a good test for yourself. Like we have like 7 options, I think it is, of the things that you could potentially want to get out of the coaching process. So for example, health, muscle gain, fat loss, strength, sport specific, weight gain, and maybe a couple of others. But they're like the main things. And then what we try and get people to do is rank them in that order of like 1 to 7 or 1 to 8 or whatever it is. So then you can kind of really get a feel for, right, like what's this person actually, what's their real priority? Because very often what I see in almost like a lot of questionnaires is like 1, 2, and 3 will always be like muscle gain, fat loss, and health. Like that they're nearly always the ones that come up. And then what's often elaborated on in the email, and I'm just bringing this up because I actually had a client who just started up yesterday, and he's a good case example. A type of guy who is in a place where he knows he wants to get bigger over time. He knows he wants to gain muscle. But he's also at a point in terms of body fat where he's like, I'm actually not comfortable with my level of body fat. I would like to be leaner. So that's the position that most people, male and female, do find themselves in. It's like, yeah, I do want to be bigger, but I also want to be leaner, because they want that like fitness model, like physique. So there, as we've talked about before, and as we'll be talking about in an upcoming podcast, you can end up spinning your wheels if you have no goals. So what I did in that case with him was essentially mapped out our first 12 weeks of the rough trajectory that we might take. Okay. So what I said was, for the first 4 to 6 weeks, we'll get a little win under our belt, get some buy-in, get you motivated by actually chasing that fat loss first, getting a little bit of that out of the way. So you're enjoying that process. We're figuring out what training might look like, figuring out, getting to know him better and stuff like that. And then we'll begin to transition towards that muscle gain goal from a nice lean starting point. So we're kind of taking his goals, we're taking all of them, we're considering them, and then we're putting them into place like on some sort of trajectory. Because that's ultimately what you need, and what most people lack is just like following one path or following some sort of path. Because once you're moving towards your destination, like you're going good. Like at the end of the day, there is no perfect ratio of, like, if we stick with the kind of physique related goal, there's no perfect ratio of like how long you spend dieting, how often you diet, how long you spend bulking. It's like that they're not the important things. The ultimate goal is to get to that end point, and there's many ways of going about that. Like you could make the argument, like it's probably not the best option, that you diet for a week, you bulk for 2 weeks. You diet for a week, you bulk for 2 weeks. Like you can get progress with that. It's probably not the best structure, in terms of consistency and stuff, but you might see similar outcomes to if you were, dieting and bulking over longer periods of time. So these are the types of things that people get really lost with, very often, because they're, you expose yourself to different views on social media, and the thing is, lots of them are often right. As in, I follow multiple different people who would have very different training philosophies, but it's kind of just a philosophy. And when you look at it in practice, it's like a lot of this stuff is actually very similar. We're all getting somewhere. We're all moving forward. Like no one's doing anything that ridiculous. But as a trainee, as an observer who mightn't understand maybe what the research says, or what the fundamental active ingredient, you could say, of making that progress is, if they don't understand that, they can get lost thinking, oh no, I've got to do mini cuts, bad long cuts are bad, or you should only diet for long periods of time, you should never diet rapidly, or it's all about mini bulks, or it's all about dirty bulking, etc. And we can all get progress with these different methods, but you need some sort of path, and to then stick to it. And that's the hard part, especially in the noise of social media, where you're presented with new options all the time. So yeah, in summary, like what we try and do, we try and rank order the person's preferences, set out some sort of path, and like often as well, it ends up with potentially reconsidering some of those goals, because that happens a lot of the time, where someone initially states their goal, but in conversation then week to week, I kind of get a different feel of like what really matters to them, and that like that first kind of thing that they expressed, maybe they weren't totally comfortable with their new coach, to really express what really bothered them, and that's where coaching becomes, more so coaching. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is the hardest thing for an individual to do themselves, right? Because, well, it's actually both the easiest thing and the hardest thing to do for yourself, right? Because setting your sights on a specific goal can be an incredibly easy thing to do, right? But it can also be the most nuanced and difficult thing to do as well. And what I mean by that is, like, you could have a very clear goal in your mind, like you could be like, I want to be an Olympian, I want to be an Olympian in, I don't know, fucking judo or something, right? You're like, that's what I want, right? So you have this clear totem where you're like, that's exactly what I'm aiming for, right? And this is why you'll find people that have like a sporting background, or people who are currently engaged in sports or whatever, seem to have an easier time with, we'll say, health and diet and all that kind of stuff, because it's like they have this guiding light. They know exactly what they're aiming towards, right? Now, the process of going about that, yeah, that might be difficult, and it might be kind of like, very individualized, and potentially wrong in some areas and potentially great in some areas, and there's all this kind of wishy-washy stuff on that path, but they at least know where they're aiming towards, right? But for the general public, you can kind of be left looking at 4 different points and kind of going, like, I kind of want to go to all of them, and what we find is best is kind of what Gary said there, where you kind of look at one of them at a time, where you kind of go, okay, so we've kind of got this, where you're like, you've got these top 5 goals, we'll say, and these top 3 goals, and this top 1 goal, right? So looking at things, yes, you might say, we'll say getting a cover model physique is your ultimate goal. You want to look like a guy or a girl that would be a cover model in a fitness magazine, right? That's your ultimate goal. So what needs to happen first is this kind of critical evaluation of where you are at. And then that kind of starts the process of looking at this longer term mapping out of a path, you know? So like Gary said, you might say that your ultimate goal is muscle gain, right? And then one of your subsequent goals down below is fat loss. But we look at where you're at the moment, right? And we see you're at that kind of, we'll say as a guy, 16 to 20% body fat, right? And you're kind of not happy with your body fat at that level. And you're looking, maybe you read some of our articles, maybe you've read or listened to other people, and they're like, yeah, this is maybe not the most optimal body fat percentage to be at for building muscle, right? Or health in general. So you're kind of like, yeah, like I also am feeling great in my physique, so maybe losing some weight would be a good idea. But I also want to be jacked. You know, I want to be bigger, and you know, you need to eat in a calorie surplus to build muscle, gain muscle. So I'm kind of looking at these two things, and I kind of want both, but I don't know how to really start maneuvering and setting this path up to get me where I ultimately want to be, right? And this is also because people generally like to think that all progress is linear and there is one path to it. And they don't kind of think that, you know, sometimes your path actually goes away from your goal to loop back around to your goal, you know? So that's basically, that's the thing about coaches. They basically are able to see the path, right? Like that's a good coach. That's what they're able to see. They're able to go, okay, so this is the path we should take you on, or this is one of the paths we could take you on that's going to ultimately get you to your goal. Whereas you as an individual, without this kind of experience, without this kind of knowledge, you're kind of left going like, geez, I actually see all these paths, or maybe you don't see half of these paths, and you're just kind of like, I see the endpoints. I see these big fucking totems in the air, and I'm like, I know where I'm aiming towards, but I seem to never be able to get anywhere close to it. I go down this path and it leads me off to this path and this path, and you're never able to fully get to your goal, right? So that's generally what coaching does. It's like, you know, it's going to take your hand, bring you down a path, and go, this is how we go about it, right? But for you as an individual listening to this, and you're kind of like, look, I don't have a coach. I don't have the money for a coach. I just need to get some help towards my goals. What you should do as an individual, and it's incredibly hard to do. And like, yes, we do have information on the website, ebooks, fucking whatever else. But even still, you might be like, look, I'm just not great at reading. Or I'm just not great at whatever. I just need some help. What you need to do is do this critical evaluation of yourself. We'll call it a needs analysis, right? Where you need to do that first thing where you're kind of like, okay, so let me just think of all the goals that I have. I'm just going to do this brain fart onto a page. Write down all my goals, like every single goal that you have, whatever the fuck it is. It could be, I want to overhead press 100 kilos. It could be completely irrelevant to anything else. Where you're like, yeah, like this is just a goal that I'm in my head, this kind of fucking, it flirts with me sometimes. I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't mind doing that. Just write them all down, right? Just all of them. Just get them all out into a page. Then start rank ordering them, you know? And like, obviously, when we do it, we have this kind of bigger or meta picture of it where it's like, yeah, muscle gain as a goal, or fat loss, or health, or whatever. But you don't need to necessarily even break them down into that. You could just be like, these are my goals. I want to bench press 140 kilos. They could be very specific goals, you know? Whatever it is, just put them down and rank order them, right? Put them all in rank where you're like, these are my most prized goals. These are the things that I think or hope to bring me the most happiness or joy or whatever the fuck in achieving them, in accomplishing them, right? Rank order them, right? But then start seeing how, or doing this kind of needs analysis of what is actually going to allow you to achieve those specific goals. Like, for example, one of your goals might be to bench 140 kilos, 315 odd pounds, right? You're like, that's my goal. That's what I want to achieve, right? That's one of your goals. And maybe you've ranked that as number one, right? And then you're like, below it, you're like, oh, fat loss is one of my goals. And muscle gain is one of my goals. And some other things are your other goals, right? So seeing your thing, and then you do a critical evaluation of where you're at the moment. You're like, yeah, I bench 100 kilos, right? So you're 40 kilos off your goal, right? and you're like, that's where I am at the moment. So where do I fall in relation to my other goals? Right? You're like, okay, so I'm actually way too high at body fat for what I actually want. Okay. So you're like, okay, well, maybe I should start thinking about addressing that first. But is that going to detract from my main goal? And you're like, okay, maybe it is. Maybe being in a caloric deficit isn't going to lend itself to being the most efficient or strongest bench presser. Okay, so you can see that, okay, maybe that's taking me away from that ultimate goal. Then you look at your other goal and you're like, oh, muscle gain. You're like, okay, so that's obviously going to hopefully help with the goal of benching 140 kilos, right? So you can start going, okay, so those two goals, they kind of pair together. Those two goals, I can start accomplishing those two things at the same time, right? But this fat loss goal, I can't really be accomplishing that at the same time as these other things. And that's not to say that, again, you can't gain strength or muscle in a deficit. I'm just saying big picture thing. It's probably not the most efficient way to go about things. So then you look at yourself and you do that critical evaluation and you're like, look, I'm actually just not happy with the way my physique looks, right? And I think day to day, I would be happier in myself, feel healthier, feel more energetic, be more likely to get to the gym, be more likely to engage in these healthful habits if I was a little bit more confident in my physique, had a little bit less body fat. And while, yes, it takes away from my ultimate goal of benching that 140 or building muscle, you start seeing that path that maybe doing a phase where you're still focusing on those other goals where you're like, yeah, I'm still doing my progressive overload in the gym. I'm still bench pressing. I'm still looking to gain muscle, gain strength in those areas, that movement. But my goal nutritionally, my goal lifestyle wise, my goal overall is to drop a little bit of body fat first till I get to that comfortable level. And then I can start really pushing towards those two other goals that I have, which is muscle gain and the 140 kilo bench press, right? So you start creating that path. But it all starts from that process of, first of all, rank ordering your goals, where you're like, these are the ones that I have. These are ones that kind of go together. They work well together. They pair well together. And these are ones that don't necessarily go with that, but maybe they're higher priority or lower priority or whatever. And you're kind of like, okay, so that makes sense with that. Then you do a kind of needs analysis of what it would take to get to those goals, what's needed for you as an individual, that kind of critical evaluation of yourself. And then you start crafting this path towards ultimately achieving those goals. And again, realizing that, sometimes you're going to have to focus on one thing almost exclusively, almost even at the expense of these other things, to eventually get back to actually hammering towards these other things. For example, another one could be, your health is not in a great position. You've a very high resting heart rate. Your blood glucose is kind of dysregulated. It's at the higher end of the range all the time when you are waking. If you're measuring HRV or whatever, that's always in a bad position. All these things, you're like, okay, look, these kind of subjective, objective health measures are not in a great place. So maybe, dieting or focusing on health for a while would be a good idea, even though it kind of detracts from your ultimate goal of being so big you blot out the sun, like whatever it is, you're going to have to do that kind of needs analysis. And sometimes it is going to be moving away from your ultimate goal to eventually go back to hammering towards your ultimate goal. So that then kind of moves into that thing we're going to talk about in a little while, which is setting these smaller goals, or rather breaking these big long-term goals up into smaller parts. But you've anything to add there now, Gary?
No, I don't think so, because the next point I was actually just going to bring up was that kind of like bringing the macro down to the micro, because that's ultimately the step that most people don't actually bother with, I think.
Yeah, so as I was saying, like, you look at these kind of totems in the distance where you're like, that's what I'm aiming towards. Yeah, the 140 bench. That's the goal. And that's all they see. Like, so in their mind, that's the only thing. There's no micro progression towards that. Like, they're not happy when they get a 120 bench. It's like, oh, well, it's not 140. I'm still not where I want to be, even though they've added 20 kilos to their bench. So that's one thing, right? And we'll kind of touch on stuff like that as well when we talk about these kind of inadequate feelings when comparing progress. But breaking your longer term goal or your bigger goal into smaller goals is a much easier way to actually achieve that goal. And again, like, this stuff doesn't just apply to the gym. Like, this is life as well. Like, there's that common enough saying where it's like, how do you eat an elephant? Like one bite at a time. Like that's how you go about achieving these goals. It's like, okay, well, what's the ultimate goal? Eat this elephant. Okay, you can't eat it in one whole bite, like unless you're fucking some sort of mutant. So you're gonna have to do smaller bites. Like, makes sense, right? Until it's eventually all gone. Easy, makes a lot of sense. But that's exactly what you have to do in the gym, where you're like, okay, so ultimately this is the goal: fat loss, muscle gain, health, strength numbers, performance, resting heart rate, whatever the fuck it is, right? And then you go, where am I now? You do that kind of critical evaluation, that critical analysis of where you are right now. You try to be as objective as possible, not like, yeah, like I know my bench is only this, but you know, the last while I haven't been focusing on it, and maybe, you know, one time in the past I actually was stronger, and like none of that shit. Where are you right now? What right now? None, not your past, not your history. I don't care who you were when you were 19 years old. Like, who are you right now? Like that's what we need to know. That's the critical evaluation point. Then you can start going, okay, so I say these things are my goal. I'm going to break them down into smaller goals. But also in that process, I'm going to look at whether that is actually my goal, right? And what I mean by that is, like, why did you pick the 140 kilo bench? Was it because you were hoping that a 140 kilo bench is going to lead to bigger chest muscles, right? Because sometimes you will get lost in the process and not actually realize your actual ultimate goals, right? Like, again, like that's a classic example where you start going, okay, well, these inputs lead to this output. And what you're actually trying to influence is the output, but you become completely obsessed with the input, even if the output isn't changing, right? And again, that the strength is a good one where people are like, oh yeah, well, I gained like 20 kilos on my bench press, right? And you're like, yeah, that's fucking unreal, because like, yeah, like you're getting stronger, whatever. But you look at them and it's like, your goal is actually to build a bigger chest, stronger chest, whatever it is. And the way you bench, it's pretty much all your fucking triceps, you know? It's like this, yeah, you have a good bench, but it's not ultimately achieving your goal, your objective, you know? So it's like, you have to be very clear in what your goal is. And again, that comes back to being honest with yourself and understanding your motivations for why you have certain goals, which is, again, it's an even deeper conversation than we could ever possibly have on the podcast, because it's almost like you need to sit down with someone and really, really analyze why they are who they are, you know? But when you've done that, then you start going into these kind of smaller goals that will add up over time. Like, you look at it, and again, this is where you start designing that path where it's like, okay, so a 140 bench, that's what I want. I'm going to start thinking about, where am I right now? So I know, we'll say 140 for one. You just want to do one rep with it, and you know you're at 100 for one right now. So then you look at, what have I been doing? What has worked for me in the past? What do these other people that have a 140 bench or more say works for them? Let me start seeing if there's some commonalities. There's some things that are, you know, seem to be working in general for people that have this as a goal or want to do this. I'm like, okay, so yeah. And again, I'm talking about people that are in similar situations to you, which is something we'll touch on in a second as well. Like, don't be comparing yourselves to someone that's on fucking 10 grams of tren a week, and you literally have the most stressful job in the world, and you can get to the gym twice per week. Like, obviously that's not a fair comparison, you know, so it has to be like with like, you know, so you have to do that. And again, this especially applies to different body types, body sizes, we'll say, in terms of, like, don't look to what made this short-armed bencher good at benching. You know, if you have this 6'8" wingspan of a bench, you know, so like, you have to look at someone that also has similar enough body to you. Like that's, you have to compare those things. Again, it has to be like to like. So doing that, then you start breaking it up into smaller goals. You go, okay, so what I want to really do now is slowly start to get stronger. So what can I do right now to influence my bench from going up from 100 kilos to 102.5 kilos? Like, what's the smallest progression you can make, right? What can you do to slowly get it up to there? right? Then you look up that information, you find out information, you consult with other individuals, you talk to other individuals, you look at what other people have been doing, and you go, okay, so this is my process. This is what I'm going to do to try influence that to get the smallest or biggest, hopefully, return on investment. You do that. You try it out for a block of training, 2 blocks of training, whatever. And then you evaluate how that went on. Because that's, again, something that people don't often do. They'll just kind of like, oh, I've set my process in place, but I've never checked back with how I'm getting towards my goals. Like, you see people like, I always just imagine if you had this like kind of progress bar over your head where it's like, you know, everything you're doing is contributing to these goals. Like, if you could see that every single day, you're like, oh, 1%, I gained 1% towards that goal. Like, that would be so motivating, right? Whereas if you see no percent towards that goal, or the negative percentage towards that goal, like, that would also be motivating where you're like, okay, so geez, I need to actually do these things to actually get what I'm looking to achieve, right? But that's the way you have to essentially do it yourself in your head, where you're like, I'm doing these things, I'm looking to get these outcomes. How are they influencing each other? Like, am I actually, the inputs I'm putting in, am I actually getting the outputs that I'm looking for, right? And you have to continually critically evaluate that until you get to this process where you're like, okay, so it seems to be that if I do 3 sets of 6 to 8 reps in the bench press for 4 weeks, and I'm keeping 1 to 2 reps in reserve, I seem to get stronger in the bench press, right? It's like, okay, so now we start getting this process. We're like, this is good. Or maybe you start noticing, you're like, yeah, if I do, I don't know, dips, my bench press seems to really, really respond well to that. I do dips, and whatever way it strengthens my chest, my shoulders, my triceps, whatever, it really has this carryover to my bench press. So I'm going to do more of those. And, oh yes, my bench press is increasing. You have to do this constant critical evaluation of how you are progressing towards those ultimate goals. And again, you've broken down that bigger goal, that 140 goal, and all you're looking for is 102.5. That's all you care about. You're just like, I'm just looking for the 2.5 kg improvement on that, right? And that's what you look for. That's what you build on. You break those bigger goals into smaller goals, and then you start influencing those smaller goals. You're like, okay, what are the inputs I can do to slowly start changing those smaller goals until those smaller goals start adding up until I eventually reach my bigger goal. Does that make sense, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the bench press example is a good one, because realistically, like, you know, people get stronger over long periods of time. And very often what happens when people set a strength goal is they're like, it's almost like this sporadic thing. You know, they've been training for 3 or 4 years, but they're like, well, I've just decided I want to add like 40 kilos to my bench. Okay, that's my goal. That's what I want. And then you ask them, it's like, oh yeah, how's your bench progress been over the last 2 years? And they're like, oh, I didn't really add much. I added maybe like just around 5 kilos or something. And then when you actually press them on that, it's like, what do you think we can actually do to get you to to add an extra 40 kilos to your bench in seemingly 6 to 12 months based on your goal? You know, realistically, there's nothing. Like, that's fairly unlikely. So if you can actually like play it out a little bit more, and I think this is hard for people to do when you're early in your 20s, especially, because you almost have this perspective that like life is pretty much over at 30. You know, that's so far away that it's like it's never coming. But if you were to genuinely ask yourself and think about it, if you're 20 years old, let's say, you know, what would you be happy? You currently bench 100 kilos, and you're like, what would you be happy to be benching by the time you're 30? Like, I don't think most people will be like, oh yeah, 250 kilos. Like, it's unlikely. Most people don't see that weight being lifted very often. They might say something like, I don't know, I think it'd be cool to bench like 160. You know, it's a very decent bench. You know, you see someone benching 160, you're like, yeah, that's pretty decent. They're pretty strong. So that's 60 kilos over the course of like 10 years that you have to add to your bench. Okay. And when you break it down like that, it's like, all right, I have to add 6 kilos a year to my bench. And obviously it's going to be non-linear, but just for the sake of simplicity, right? You have to add 6 kilos per year. It's like, all right, what's that per month? It's like half a kilo a month. It's like, when you break it down to that level, it makes it much easier to not just lose your shit when you're planning your training. Because this is what people tend to do. They set the crazy bench press goal, and then they're like, right, I got to bench like 5 times a week, and I'm going to do like 12 sets per session because it's my goal. Whereas in fact, it's really ultimately about breaking it down to the small behaviors that matter the most. Like, it could be the case that over the last 2 years, you've missed every fourth bench session, and every third bench session you train with your friend, and you just go in and max out and you don't follow your program. And then the occasional session, you've got a bit of shoulder pain, so you kind of just do really light work and you don't do much. So as you begin to spot those little holes and you make your small goals really, very manageable, like a half kilo a month, 6 kilos a year, like that's a pretty decent, very realistic goal. And you spot all those holes in your program, and then you just begin, like, putting tape over them. You're just patching up all the holes, and then you start to just make small little adjustments over time. But that's very often like not what people do. The exact same thing happens with weight loss. Like my mom's probably a good example. Mothers are good examples in general. They'll be like, I want to lose a stone. And it's like, okay, cool. And then they go to their Weight Watchers or Slimming World weigh-in, and they're like, oh, I only lost a pound this week. Mary lost like 12 pounds. I only lost a pound. And it's like, yeah, like, are you not planning on keeping this going? Like, in 3 months' time, you'll have lost that stone and it'll be gone. And it's like, oh, all right. If you just achieve that small little bit of progress, really small bits over time, it actually does really accumulate. And the same thing happens with studying and stuff like that. Like people always ask us for like advice about, the best study tips and how to really knuckle down and focus. When in fact, it's like, just set a basic habit that you do 30 to 60 minutes of reading a day. Like, that's quite a bit. I'd start at 10 minutes.
Fuck that. Yeah, literally just be like, right, look, you've never studied in your life before. You've never sat down. Can you do 5 minutes? Like, literally just 5 minutes. Do that.
Yep.
And then just micro progression from there. And that's ultimately what you're talking about. Is just like, what are these small, easy micro progressions you can do? And again, like, I know we're talking about the gym, but it applies to everything. Like, we've talked about this before, where people kind of ask us like, oh, how do I wake up early in the morning? And you're just kind of like, why do you want to wake up early in the morning? Like, you already waste 4 hours per day on social media. Like, what do you think waking up earlier is going to accomplish? You already have an easy win there. Just get rid of those 4 hours of social media, and then all of a sudden you have 4 hours extra in your day. You don't have to change your sleep schedule at all. You just have opened up 4 hours extra in your day. So again, like you're saying, like, you're just kind of like, look at these little things where you're like, I can just patch that up. I can just fix that. I can just micro progression here. And it does all accumulate.
Yeah. And I think when people set goals, they never look back. And I think it's really important to look back, because realistically, your last year of your life, like, it's probably going to give us a good idea of what your next year is going to be like. For most people, most of the time, that's true. You may have had a calling, your whole life has changed and you change everything about yourself, and that might totally change the way you live your life. But most of the time, like, your last year is probably going to be very similar to the way you live next year, in terms of like if you look into your bank account and you actually look into, if you've got like online banking, you can see your expenditure each month, how much you spend on each thing over time. Some of those will be direct debits, some of those will be coffees, some of those will be, the time you eat out at the weekend. And there's all these little things that you never actually see until you look, because they're all just these small behaviors that you're not even thinking about when it comes to your behavior change. And that saving is another good example. When you're trying to save money, people are like, well, I'm going to put away 50% of my income every week. And it's like, just delete a few of the subscriptions that you've got, stop drinking coffee, bring a flask from home, all these little things that you just don't think about. So it is important to look back and to ask yourself, right, what have I been doing until now? What problems could potentially be there? And what are the easiest little things that I could fix? Because there are so many easy things that you could fix. Like, for example, the time on the phone is a good one. Like, people who do spend 4 hours, 5 hours on social media a day, I think the average is 5 hours. The average like screen time is around 5 hours. So like, that's a lot, and it's not a case of being like, oh, you're a bad person, like, try and do 0 hours. It's like, no, like, why don't you actually just start with, right, 4.5 hours, and now you've got a half an hour that you can either prep your meals, you can get a decent run in, you could actually do a full workout in if you were smart with your programming, or you could go and do some study. It's like, all of those things over time lead to very meaningful changes in your quality of life, and it's just 30 minutes. So you do have to view it on that micro level if you want to make meaningful change over time.
Right. So I think that hopefully it does set people up in terms of thinking about these kind of goals, like actually setting goals in a kind of more solid framework. But then what I also want to touch on is some of the reasoning behind why people set these mega goals and why people fail them. And one of them is because they look at what other people are doing and they compare themselves to those other people. Right?
Mm.
What I mean by that is, like, you'll see someone that, I don't know, has a following that you want, or has a physique goal that you want, or has a strength goal, or has a health goal, whatever the fuck, whatever goal it is, you know. And again, this is life as well too, you know, this kind of keeping up with the Joneses type mentality, right? When you do that, like, you don't, like, you have to compare yourself to the same standards, the same criteria, right? And this is something that's really, like, incredibly hard to do on social media, because, like, you don't actually get a glimpse into someone's life from social media. Like, all you get is the most fleeting of glimpses, not even into their life, this fleeting glimpse of a life they want to show you, right? And I know social media, everyone always says that, where they're like, oh, well, this is just real life, I'm just showing myself or whatever. But even that stuff is, like, curated, that stuff is tailored. Like, that still probably took about 50 fucking selfies to get that picture, you know? So it's like, that's also not reality, even if they're trying to be real talk or whatever the fuck, you know? So you have to realize that. And you as an individual can't compare yourself to someone that is in a completely different situation. And then we've talked about it before, like, everyone wants to be an individual until we start talking about outcomes. And then all of a sudden everyone wants to be someone else. You know, everyone wants, oh, like, oh, I want to be individual. I want to do things my way. I want to do this. But then it's like, oh, well, these people have earned millions. Oh, well, like, I should be able to do that. Or these people have, like, physiques that are idolized. Oh, I should be able, you know. It's like, you have to own you being an individual, you know. And that means that you have this responsibility to, well, take responsibility for your life. And again, like, this kind of, everyone hates the term responsibility because we have this dichotomous thought process, or this false equivalence thought process, where we think, like, fault and responsibility are the same thing, you know, and they have the same kind of negative connotation, where it's like, something can be your responsibility, but it's not your fault, you know. Like, if you have poor socioeconomic background, you know, and as a result you have ill health or poorer health, you know, because you've never had access to good nutrition advice, good food, good whatever the fuck, you live in a poorer socioeconomic demographic, and as a result you just don't have this higher standard of living, right? That's not your fault. Like, you were born into that, right? But it's your responsibility to get out of it. Like, no one else can, like, yeah, okay, we can say, like, oh, we can give you money, or we can give you these resources, or we can do whatever. But, like, even if you just give someone something, it doesn't actually influence the outcome that you want always. And what I mean by that is, like, yes, like, you can pretty much be assured that if you're in someone that is in this low socioeconomic environment, and I give you enough money that you don't have to be poor and are actually able to afford food, like, we can be pretty assured that you're going to pay your money for food, or you use your money for food to some extent, you know. Like, it might not be to the same extent that some people say you should. Like, there's always this conversation, especially, like, in America and stuff, where they use, like, EBT cards and stuff, you know, that kind of, it's like, you know, what we use that kind of dole stuff for, you know. And it's like, you see people, like, eating lobster and stuff. They always use these kind of exaggerated people, where it's like, yeah, they're using these things where it's supposed to be for, like, survival food, and they're using it for fine dining. Like, you're always going to have this exaggerated, hyperbolic, like, meme, essentially. But you can be pretty much assured that if you do give people money, they're going to spend it on food, and that's going to influence the outcome to some extent. But it's also not going to influence the outcome entirely, because just because you have access now to food doesn't mean you know what good food is. Doesn't mean you know how to effectively manage that money. It doesn't mean you've mastered all these kind of, we'll call them soft skills associated with that. You know, like, and that's stuff that takes time. You know, and obviously education, and obviously that education is a responsibility that you have to undertake yourself. Like there's information free all over the internet, but it's still your responsibility to go out and find it if you want to know it. Like it's not like we're in the Matrix and I can just upload something into your brain and you just know it now forever. Like we're not at that stage. Maybe we will get to that stage one day, but we're not there yet. So ultimately it's your responsibility to go out and actually do these things, you know? And this going back to what we were saying is the kind of thing that people fall down on with comparing themselves on social media. Like they'll compare themselves to someone that doesn't have the situation that they have. Like you're comparing yourself to someone that can train whenever the fuck they want. Like their only job is to be a social media influencer, you know? Like it doesn't matter if they're like, look, you know, I actually woke up a little bit tired today. I'm actually just going to sleep in because the only thing I have on my schedule today is to go to the gym for 2 hours. And the only thing else I have to do after that is just take a sick pic for Instagram, lash it on Instagram, and we're good. You know, like that's their day, you know? And you're comparing that because they can just sleep in. They're like, I'm tired today, I'll just sleep in. You're comparing that to yourself who's trying to get a gym session in before work. You know, it's fucking, you used to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning, you're groggy, you're wiping sleep out of your eyes, and you're just like, I just don't want to fucking do this, you know? And then you're like, like one of the kids was up last night sick, you know, or they were crying and like they had a nightmare, whatever the fuck. You have all these other things, these other responsibilities that you are in charge of, these other stressors, whatever the fuck. And you're trying to compare your progress to someone who literally is living this carefree, happy-go-lucky life where it's like, yeah, I'm sorted, I'm an influencer, you know? And you're trying to compare yourself to that. And it's like, that's just an unrealistic comparison. That's just not a fair comparison for you. Like if someone else said that they were comparing themselves, like for example, like if your girlfriend came to you, Gary, and she was like, oh, Gary, I feel really bad because I'm looking at these people that have, I don't know, fucking fake lips, fake boobs, fucking whatever, and I'm comparing myself to them. You would look at that and be like, why are you comparing yourself to them? Like this is not, like, why do you value that, first of all? But it's also like, why, like that, this is not a fair comparison. Like you're looking at someone that has paid for these things. They just got like silicone injected into them, or not injected into them, surgically attached to them. And it's like this, like you're not comparing the same thing here, you know? So it's not a fair comparison. But unfortunately, that's the kind of stuff that occurs on social media. It's like you're comparing yourself to, first of all, again, this hyperbolic image of someone that they've curated to make look a certain way, to make their lifestyle look a certain way, you know, and they've posed for the photo, they've done whatever, and they have no stress in their life, they have no extra stuff. Like you see people, like, again, complaining on social media, you see bodybuilders do it as well, like all the time, and it's like, this is like the easiest thing ever you appear to be doing, and you're complaining about it. Like it's like a privilege is what you're doing, you know? But then people start comparing themselves to that, not realizing, well, maybe they do realize, but not being able to step back and actually, you know, be objective with it. And they're kind of like, oh, well, why haven't I in this position? Or why don't I have this look? Or why don't I have this physique? Or why don't I have this outcome? Whatever it is. And it kind of, it baffles me sometimes. But at the same time, like, I've done that so many times, you know? And it's like, it's kind of hard to see yourself in that position when you're in that position. What are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, and I think one of the bigger problems as well is that, like it is a good, I think it is, of course, like what we're not saying is like you shouldn't strive for the people that are to be like the people that are the best at what they do that you want to do. Like, yeah, you should. But what we're often seeing when it comes to like body composition outcomes and physique stuff is you're actually you're setting a goal based on someone that was actually pretty much selected to be in the position that is in front of your eyes, as in by virtue of them having a large following, the fact that they have a large following, the fact that they are an influencer, like it's pretty much solely because they're an outlier. Like that's why. It's because this person is, really good looking, they're going to sell products, and they had this unreal response to training and just happened to have the perfect genetics for, to be a fitness model. And it's like, that's not to take away from their work, like not at all. More power to people who are in that position, not at all. But what you have to realize is that there are certain advantages that may have been built in that you may not actually be able to achieve, and that's the difficult part of it. It's a bit like people just assuming that if they want to get better as a powerlifter, they have to compare themselves to like Larry Wheels or Dan Green, or the guys that are at the absolute elite level. And it's like, it's not just a case of following their program and then getting there. And it's the same thing when it comes to the influencers, but it's even more more radical, because essentially all the lifestyle factors that you talked about, it's not just a case that you don't have as much time to go to the gym, but it's also a case that the additional stressors and the additional potential sleep deprivation, etc., also affects your results negatively. So you've got multiple things that are essentially working against you. So while you can aim at those targets for inspiration, and I think you should, like I think some people get too realistic in their goal setting and they don't actually aim high at all. You still should be aiming high and overshooting to some degree, but you don't want to be waking up every day and doing that as like your day-to-day measurement. Like the only thing you should, like, it's obviously ridiculously cliche, but the only thing you should be comparing yourself to like day-to-day is like who you were yesterday or last week or last month. Because if it's just someone else all the time, then one, you may never get there, so you may just be unhappy and not satisfied for the rest of your life. And two, you may eventually get there, but you're not going to enjoy the process in the meantime. So the only way you can accept those wins is if you're able to appreciate the fact that you are making progress and that you're actually doing a good job, assuming you are. So
yeah, and it does also actually work the opposite way. And one of the things you brought up was like, powerlifters and stuff comparing themselves to like Larry Wheels or Dan Green. Like you'll see this with people that, we'll say like someone who takes like, I don't know, steroids or something. Like they still compare themselves to natural lifters, when it's like you've gone past that. Like, and obviously we can talk about a fucking fake natty debate or whatever, but what I mean is like someone who is relatively large or whatever, and they then compare themselves to smaller natural lifters, and they're like, oh, these guys are so fucking small. And it's like, yeah, but you once you take steroids, you've left that bracket, right? You're now in the bracket of steroid users, right? So you're now at the bottom of that totem pole, or that category. You can't compare yourself to someone that's in a different category. You have to compare yourselves to fucking, I don't know, Brandon Curry or fucking whatever. You'd be like, okay, well, why am I as big as those guys? Like that's what you're now comparing to. Like, again, like I always think is like people say shit about like bodybuilding, and they're like, it kind of fucks my brain, because I'm like, if you go down that route and then you complain that, oh, all these top guys are on more drugs, I'm like, it's just such a cop out, because it's like, well, then do more drugs. Like it's a simple solution. It's not like that. Like that's if you go into a non-tested federation and you then complain that these other individuals are doing more drugs than you, it's like, then just do more drugs. It's like, this is not a fair comparison. It's like you're just making excuses for why you're not higher up than what you want to be, which is the exact same thing that people do with their physiques, with their thing, natural, enhanced, whatever. And it's like this whole thing, it's like people end up never being happy. There's always someone else that's better than you, better looking than you, richer than you, fucking bigger dick than you, whatever the fuck it is, whatever metric you want to measure, there is someone better than you. Like very, very few people are the best in the world at a certain thing, right? And very, very few people are the best in the world at everything. In fact, there's probably no. Right? So you have to keep that in mind, especially if you have multiple goals and you have multiple lifestyle variables that maybe these people that you're following or looking up to don't have to contend with. So like Gary said, it ends up being the only fair comparison is you to you. It's like, where were you yesterday? Who were you yesterday? What were you yesterday? Are you doing the things that are needed to get you better tomorrow day? You know, like that's essentially what you want to do. You know, so this comparison where you kind of look at other people, it's just not a fair comparison. You know, this is also true as well, especially in the fitness industry. For guys, first of all, because the vast majority of people you look up to in the fitness industry are 5'5", right? They weigh about 80 kilos, or not even 80 kilos, 70 kilos. So they look jacked as fuck, you know. But you're 6'2" or whatever, and you're like, geez, I don't look that big. But you stand beside them in person, and you just tower over them. Like, you look way bigger than them. You're also 100 kilos or whatever. So that's not a fair comparison, first of all, right? And for females, man, I would absolutely hate to be a female. Man, people in the fitness industry, you can get away with being a fitness influencer purely based on having a favorable fat distribution profile. Like, you could literally, like, as a female, both the easiest thing ever and the hardest thing ever. Because it's easy in the fact that all you have to do is be born with favorable fat storage. As long as you store fat in your titties and your ass, you're pretty good to go in the fitness industry. You know, on Instagram, on all these social media platforms, as long as you don't mind, you know, wearing a bikini or wearing like scantily clothes or whatever, man, you're golden as long as you store body fat in your titties and your ass. Like, you're good, you know? So really easy in that regard. Also, way, way harder in the other regard, because if you don't have that, man, you have to compete with that. Someone that just has these quote unquote optimal genetics for this. And then you're always going to be left comparing yourself to them. And you're like, all right, well, I have fucking 32 double A's. I can't get my fucking titties out here. You know, it's like, I also tend to store body fat on my abdomen and not my ass. So what the fuck can I do? You can train your ass off, and if you compare yourself to these individuals, or worse still, do the exercises that these individuals tend to propagate, you're just always going to be left disappointed, you know? So for guys, for girls, you're both left in a shit position unless you actually compare yourself to yourself, you know?
Yeah, so like, again, you can definitely use the individuals that you want to look like or you want to perform like as inspiration, and I think you should. But what you should take away from it is more so like, all right, what sort of things can I take away from their process, you know, as opposed to their outcome? Because like, it's pointless to wake up every day and to just consider the outcome. Like, some people might work like that. Like, some people might have, I don't know, a poster of Rob Lipsett on their wall or something, and they wake up every day and they're like, I want to be like Rob, you know, and that's fine. You know, if you look up to him, you know, he's a great guy and you should look up to him. But, you know, if that's the way you compare yourself every day, I'm like, all right, that's probably not like the best thing to do, but there you go. So take away the process. Like, if we stick with that example of Rob or whatever, like, instead of thinking, going on to like Rob Lipsett's Instagram and being like, all right, I want to look like him, like, gonna look like him now in this year, you should actually think, right, you know, how long has Rob been training? Right, he's been training for about a decade. Okay, over the last 4 years of his YouTube videos, he's been tracking his macros and his calories like all the time, consistently. You know, didn't go out drinking that much with the lads. You know, it rarely missed workouts and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, they're probably the things that you could take away from that example. You know, from someone that you might look up to. You're actually thinking about what they're doing, and then you do that on average across multiple different people, because there's going to be outliers. Like, you're going to find some lad that like goes to Ibiza all the time and just eats pizza and he's in savage shape, and it's like, all right, maybe don't take that process. But on average, like, if you look across people you look up to, you'll see a lot of commonalities, and then you take away those processes, those behaviors, and essentially start to make those micro goals like we discussed. You know, because if you look to your favorite fitness model or whatever, what you're going to see is they probably gain most of their muscle in their first few years, and maybe they've gained a kilo a year if they're lucky for the last 5 years. You know, so then you have to think, all right, is it likely that I'm going to somehow gain 5 kilos a year every year? Probably not. So yeah, it can be a positive thing if you know how to use those comparisons or as inspiration, and what you can, and to take the right thing he's away from them.
Yeah, and that was kind of the final thing that I wanted to touch on, was you also have to look at things on the grander scale. Like comparing yourself to someone's essentially end point and then you being at your start point is the most unfair comparison ever, right? Because like you could have the most sickening muscle building genetics ever, you know, like you could just be a complete hyper responder. But if you compare yourself to someone at their end phase, like end goal, like again, we'll just use Lipset as a an archetype. You know, if you just compare yourself to where he is now, and don't compare yourself to where he was when he started, you know, it's just not a fair comparison, and that can lead you down the road of just being like, look, I don't look like that right now, so fuck this. I'm obviously not good at training. I'm obviously just not meant for this. I'm not getting the results that he has. I don't look like him. I don't whatever. So, you know, fuck this, you know. But because you haven't put in the 2 to 3 years, to 5 years, to 10 years to actually see where your genetics can take you, like it's just not a fair comparison. Whereas if you look at someone that you look up to and you look, okay, well, where did they start out? And you're like, oh, geez, actually, we were fairly similar in terms of our body types starting out. And this person has unreal like results. Maybe if I just stick with it, like they've actually been training for 10 years. So I just have to stick with it for 10 years and I'll be in a good position, hopefully, you know? And again, that's something that you really kind of forget is a thing. Like you just kind of think of like the present day right now, right this very second, you know? And you should be looking into the past. And that's not to say that, you know, what these individuals did to get to that position is always the most optimal or right or beneficial or whatever, but you still have to look to the past, to what they did, to where they were, to who they were, and to how they got to the point that you ultimately want to get to, you know? So you have to compare like to like, whatever way you fucking cut it. You have to compare like to like, and that involves both that temporal thing and that spatial thing, where it's like this: the time point has to be the same, has to be a fair comparison, and also it has to be a fair comparison in terms of, you know, we'll say anthropometry, in terms of your physiques. Like you can't compare yourself. Like if I was comparing myself to someone that was 5'5" and look at their muscle building capacity and look at myself and I'm like 6'5.5", it's like it's just not a fair comparison. If I try to do what they do, like it's just not going to be the same. Like even down to like exercise selection and stuff, it's like this is again a larger discussion where you see people be like, oh, this is the one exercise. And it's like, yeah, that's the one exercise for you because your body is perfectly suited to that exercise. You get a great response from it, whereas like mine, it's just not, you know. So when you look at someone's process, you have to compare like to like, and you have to actually look at what was the overarching like central themes that ran through this that eventually led them to the point that they're at, you know. That's what you ultimately have to do, rather than this like, oh geez, he's fucking jacked, you know, I have to be that tomorrow, you know. It's just not, it's not realistic. It's not a fair comparison, and it actually more often than not deters you from ultimately achieving your goals. Because I know so many lads that actually have unreal genetics for muscle building, but because they don't end up after 12 weeks looking like their favorite fucking YouTuber or whatever, they're like, oh no, fuck this shit. Like I'm just not arsed anymore. And it's like, and you literally gained like 6 kilos in those 12 weeks of muscle. If you just continue doing this, even if we half that rate for the next 12 weeks and half it again, you're going to be fucking huge. You're going to be jacked in like fucking 2 to 3 years. But it's like, nah, they're just not ours. Fuck that. And I always think that as well. Like people always talk about like, oh, you know, these people are just the outliers and fucking whatever. And it's like, we're actually discussing outliers of outliers, because I know so many people that have way better muscle building genetics, way better fat loss genetics, muscle insertions, shape, whatever. And they're just like, yeah, I just train for fun or whatever. Like I know one guy, he just fucking works in finance, and one guy physiotherapy. And like, they are the most, actually one of Lippy's friends, right, is the most aesthetic individual I have ever seen in my life. And he's just like, no, I actually just rather have a real job and just, you know, do that. He just trains for the crack, like, you know? So it's like, you have to actually realize that not only are these the outliers of the outliers that are doing well in the fitness industry or whatever, but also if they were to compare themselves to other people, they ain't worth fucking jack shit. Those other people are just focusing on other things, you know? So like the king can always be dethroned. So you have to keep that in mind when you look at the people you look up to. It's like, well, like, yes, like Gary said, you can definitely use them for inspiration, motivation, information, but ultimately it's you as an individual that has to take responsibility and go about achieving your goals.
Yep. And it all becomes really simple in the long term. It's just about actually sticking with it in the short term. Because like, I mean, if you were to ask like, right, how do you actually gain loads of muscle over time? It's like focus on trying to increase your 10 rep max on all of your lifts annually and gain a few kilos a year. Simple. There you go. That's it. Like that's most of it. You have to be gaining weight over time, and you have to probably increase your rep maxes across multiple sets is probably advisable on, you know, a handful of lifts that train most of your muscles, and you're going to gain a lot of muscle over time. But it's the what do they call it, fuck arounditis that happens in between that time, and that tends to mess people up. Because what tends to happen is, as we said at the beginning of the podcast, you start to see different people doing different things. You don't have like a guiding path. You don't have like basic behaviors in place. So you're just chopping and changing all the time. And then you're there after 2 years and you're like, oh God, I actually didn't make any progress. I haven't changed. But I just followed this new guy and he's got the answer. And you kind of keep going like that. So yeah, things, you know, we talk about complicated things sometimes. We try and, you know, delve into like what the research says about stuff. But at the end of the day, the long-term things that you actually need to do to be in good shape are very simple in theory, but much more difficult in practice. So that's why that kind of micromanagement of your behaviors is probably your best way forward, while still having some guiding path as well, for sure.
100%. So I think that covers everything. Few tangents as per usual.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything else to add to this, Gary?
No, but I think this should hopefully be a useful podcast, considering, as you said at the start, we always say, you know, depending on your goals. And I think this is a necessary podcast to be able to integrate some of the other information that we discussed. I think if you listen to the generalist approach podcast and you listen to this podcast, I think if you're that type of person who has all of the goals but no guiding path, I think this should really put you in a better place in terms of trying to understand like what you need to do and how you need to go about it. And obviously all the other episodes and the information on site is going to be helpful too. But yeah, hopefully you know where you're going. And if not, if you have no idea what to do, you know, you listen to the podcast, you're like, oh, I just need to ask you guys additional questions. That's what the Facebook group is for. So make sure you're in there. You know, some people have been posting form checks and questions, etc. And that's what we want. We want to build a little bit of a community. So get involved.
Yep. Or obviously, if you do have very, very specific needs, questions, whatever, coaching is always an option. So that's the Greasy Salesman pitch done. The link is in the description. You know yourself.
Link.
But yeah, like Gary said, at the end of the day, we are trying to build a community in the Facebook group. So it does help us. It does help you to actually get your ass in there. Yeah, I actually don't think I have anything else to add to that. We will eventually be putting some kind of articles together on needs analysis, goal setting, that kind of stuff, both in the nutrition section and the training section. So if you're not reading the articles on site, just realize, if you're not reading the articles on site and you're just listening to the podcast, realize that you're missing maybe 90% of the information, maybe, if not more.
That's accurate.
And like ultimately that is our goal, is to build the resource where you guys can all go to and just be like, all right, actually I can find out all the information that I need on specific topics, whatever it is. And also there is a community that can help me answer questions or help my thought processes around whatever issues you're having, because that's ultimately what we want to achieve. We want to help as many people as we can actually get access to the information that they need, and also understand the information that they need. Because like that was the biggest thing that both myself and Gary were seeing within the fitness industry was, yeah, there is information available. And like I said earlier on, like you could be in a position where you just don't have the resources to actually understand this information or to actually apply this information. And that could be, again, through no fault of your own. So that's ultimately what our goal is, to actually help and empower as many people as possible to actually understand what needs to be done, what is effective and what's not, or whatever, within both training and nutrition, and basically how to create better humanoids. So that's what we're trying to do on site. So if you're not there, you are missing out on that. We do have then the beginner's ebook available. So if you are in your first 1 to 3 years of training, that covers a lot. Like we're making some more ebook template type things, and it kind of goes on the prerequisite that you've already read the beginner's ebook, or at least have the knowledge that is in the beginner's ebook. Because like this is one of those things where it's actually quite annoying, because people think they're more advanced than they are. And what I mean by that is they think they know more than they are, or more than they do. And like you'll say something, because someone will say to you like, oh yeah, I have like 5 years training experience, and then you'll say something which we would consider very like basic knowledge, and they just have no idea about that, you know. And you're kind of like, I now have to question your entire knowledge base, you know. It's like, well, I don't know what you actually know, and because you don't know this fundamental thing, it's like I don't know anything that you know now. I don't know if you know anything at all, you know. So we kind of go on the prerequisite that you either have the knowledge or that you've read the beginner ebook, and then the templates will then allow you to kind of more put things into an applicable manner, if that makes sense, you know, where you're just like, oh, these are some templates that I could follow, and I know why and how to adjust them over time based on my needs, you know. So they will be coming out soon. We do still have online coaching spaces available. We do have group coaching, you know yourself. That's what we got. I have nothing else to add, Gary. Do you?
Nope, I think that's pretty good stuff.
All right, fantastic.
It's too easy.
It literally is too easy.